Hey, and welcome to Module 3, Week 3, Lecture 9, the Deuteronomistic History and the Judges. I do want to thank David Wanamaker again for his work in putting these lectures together. I note that some of this I'll be reading just because I don't want to leave things out, and I can't memorize that much material for a lecture. So here we go. So before we talk about the book of Judges in this lecture, I'd like to discuss something of the compositional importance. Go ahead and get your timeline out as I explain. We just recently finished the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So now we've moved on to another category of texts that include Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Remember, in the Jewish canon, which is different, same books, but different composition than the Christian Old Testament. In the Jewish canon, there are 3 parts. The Torah, which is the law or instruction, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. According to the Jewish canon, we are now into the prophets. The prophets are divided up into 2 parts, the former prophets and the latter prophets. Interestingly, the prophetic books do include the works of the prophets, but they also include history, so it's just interesting to know. The prophets are divided into 2 parts. Yeah, I just said that. All the books we're dealing with in this module constitute the former prophets. For some other perspectives on the canon and how, or the Bible, and how the canonical books are categorized, like in the Christian perspective, you can look at the canonization chart on page 2155 in your JSB Bible. And that chart's very handy for keeping everything straight as we work our way through the course. I recommend actually putting a bookmark there. That would be helpful for you. Next module, we'll be observing the latter prophets. There's a significant note to be made here with the former prophets that we need to quickly discuss. There are 2 significant dates in your timeline that we will briefly mention and go into more detail in further modules. Look at the date later on your timeline, 722, where it says the fall of the northern kingdom, and then 586, where it says the fall of the southern kingdom. You're going to see in the book of Kings that Israel will divide into these 2 kingdoms, the north and south, or Israel and Judah. And these are the dates that they fall. In 722, the Assyrians, who are the big baddies of the ancient Near East, invade the northern nation Israel. And in 586 BC, the Babylonians invade the southern nation Judah. As you can imagine, this is a very traumatic time for the Israelites. As a political entity, they are wiped out, and only a remnant of the people survive in exile. Again, we'll get to that in more depth in later modules. But what does this have to do with the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings? This position is somewhat controversial, but it's widespread enough that we need to discuss it here. Some scholars insist that these books, the former prophets, were written and or compiled between the dates of these invasions, so between 722 and 586. Or maybe even after 586. It's theorized by these scholars that while they were being invaded during this time, the Israelites said to themselves, "Why are all these horrible things happening to us? It must be because we went wrong somewhere with God's laws and covenants." So they wrote the books of Joshua through Kings, and many even say Deuteronomy would be included in this, to answer this theological question of why is this happening to us. They traced themselves back through history and compiled this collection to make sense out of this tragedy. This history is called the Deuteronomic history. Personally, I'm somewhat hesitant to accept all aspects of the theory, though I acknowledge that it's very useful in studying some of the theology behind the former prophets. If you'd like more information on this history, there are lots of places to look it up online. For now, be sure to keep the Deuteronomic history in mind as we explore these books of the Bible in this module and as they try to display the wrongdoings and the pitfalls of the Israelites that eventually lead to the tragedy of being utterly defeated in war. So let's go ahead and continue our survey where we left off, which is the book of Judges. Last lecture, we walked quickly through the book of Joshua, where the Israelites finally make it to the promised land. And after Moses' death, they follow Joshua, enter into the land of Canaan, they begin to defeat the Canaanites and all the other ites that are living in the land and seize the land from the inhabitants that are there. This portion of the Israelite history is known as the conquest. Once they finally obtain the land, they enter the part of history known as the settlement. And this is where we are with the book of Judges. The events that in this book probably took place between somewhere around 13 and 1200 BC. And you can look at the period of Judges on your timeline to get an idea where this falls. In terms of structure, it's literally written in a cycle. Right? So there are 4 components found in almost every single story in the book of Judges. They include this. Israel, the people of Israel, do what's evil in the eyes of the Lord. Yahweh gets angry and hands them over to their enemies. The enemies come in, maybe they burn the crops, maybe they put the people into captivity. Don't utterly defeat them, but they are in bondage sometimes. So that's part 2. God hands them over to their enemies. The people of Israel, after being defeated by their enemies, cry out to Yahweh for help, and Yahweh raises up a deliverer or a judge to save them. And you can clearly see this cycle taking place in Judges 1 through 4, which you may have already read at this point. If not, see if you can see the cycle happening as you work through these chapters. Keep your eyes open for it also in later chapters as you read about Deborah and Gideon. Again, the same cycle, these same 4 things that happen. If you get the time, Samson's story is also worth the read in chapters 13 through 16. It's almost written in a comedic style. Despite this comedy that is Samson and his story, Yahweh still uses him to save Israel. Finally, while it's not in the required readings, I do encourage you to read the story about the Levite and his concubine, which is in chapter 19. This section is just tragedy, and it is awful, and it's kind of gross and violent. It would be shocking to hear it in a Sunday school or to hear a pastor preach from it on a Sunday morning. But if you get the time, I'd like you to read it because it's important to know Scripture includes it. If nothing else, it's a solid account that really displays how terrible things had become in Israel during the period of the Judges. Again, this was a time that everybody was doing what they felt was right in their own eyes and living basically selfishly for themselves. The final judge in this period of the Judges is Samuel, and we'll pick up with him in the next lecture as the Israelites decide to anoint a king and enter into a time of monarchy. And that'll be an interesting story for us to pick up on.